Hey everyone, welcome to another Web Data Connector tutorial. Today we're going to be covering the topic of OAuth and how to build OAuth authentication into your Web Data Connector. So, under what circumstances would you want to use OAuth? Anytime that you want the user of your WDC to be able to access their private information that comes from a third party, you're going to want to use OAuth. For example, if you wanted your end user to be able to access their Facebook account data or their Google Sheets data, you would need to use OAuth to do this securely. We're going to talk about the highlights here, and if you'd like more info and a detailed walkthrough, please consult the written tutorial. To start with, we're going to go through a quick demo of what we're going to be building here. So I'm going to open Tableau, head over to the Web Data Connector, and go to my Foursquare connector. Foursquare is a service that provides people information about venues in their local neighborhood. It gives information like ratings and popularity of different places, be it a restaurant or a museum or any other type of venue. Here you have the ability to connect to Foursquare through OAuth. So I'm going to click here. You'll notice that this takes me to a Foursquare website. And I'm going to go ahead and enter my credentials here. When I click Login and Allow, I'll be directed back to the WDC, and I'll be signed in with Foursquare. With OAuth in this WDC, we can access information that's specific to the end user, which is really cool. We're going to bring back data about the venues on Foursquare that the user has liked. So with this information, we can build a unique viz for the user. As you can see, I've already made a viz that shows all the locations of the venues that this user has liked, just like that. So what is OAuth? Simply put, OAuth is an authentication protocol that allows an application, in this case the WDC, to request specific resources from a resource provider, Foursquare in this example, on behalf of a specific resource owner, the user that logs into Foursquare through your WDC. This is a more secure and reliable alternative to the application asking the user directly for their username and password. There are two versions of OAuth, 1.0 and 2.0. We will be using 2.0 in this tutorial. This is a simplified view of what the OAuth flow looks like. There's a resource owner, let's call him Bob, who will go to an application, your Web Data Connector. The application will then send Bob to the resource provider and ask him for specific permissions for different resources. So, in this case, the WDC would like access to Bob's photo. In order to do this, the application needs to be registered with the resource provider. For example, your WDC will need to register with Google in order to receive Google app credentials in the form of a client ID and a client secret. The client ID is public, but the client secret needs to be kept secure. Bob will log into the resource provider's site, Google for example, and then explicitly permit the application to have access to his Google resources. Once this happens, Google will send back an access token to the application, the Web Data Connector. With this access token, the application can now make requests to Google on behalf of Bob. There are a few benefits to the OAuth protocol. The first one is that it allows the user to have granular control over their resources. The user can allow one application to have access to their profile picture and their name, and they can have another application have access to their location. The second benefit is that it allows authentication to be revoked at any time. If it turns out that an application is malicious, a user doesn't need to go into Foursquare and change their password. They can just revoke access to that. In practice, the OAuth flow is a little more complicated than the simple flow on the previous side. For some very simple applications that don't access secure data, you can get away with performing all of your OAuth in the client application. This is discussed in more detail in the written tutorial. However, for most web data connectors and most applications, you will need to add a new component. This is a proxy server. In our sample, we're going to use a node server, but you can use whatever backend you want. The reason we need a proxy server is pretty simple. For most OAuth flows, if you want to receive access to a user's resources for an extended amount of time, you'll need to request access using your client secret. You can't store your client secret in client JavaScript code because then anyone could access it and begin impersonating your application. So we need to have a proxy server to keep this safe. This proxy server will handle OAuth requests for your application and give the access token to the client when needed. So here's a concrete example of how OAuth works in the case of our Foursquare WDC. We begin with the end user, the WDC user. They will head to your WDC client app. After this, the client app is going to route the user to the Foursquare login. Once on Foursquare, the user will log in and allow access to the WDC. When that happens, Foursquare will head back to the redirect URI that we've provided. I'll talk more about that a bit later. And they're going to return a short code that allows us to the next step, which is requesting a long-lived access token. Once our server has requested this access token, Foursquare will grant us access and return this token, and now we can use this token to make API requests on behalf of the user. It's worth noting that the OAuth 2.0 spec is not extremely strict, so you'll see a fair amount of differences between different OAuth implementations, just something to watch out for and be aware of. To finish this tutorial, we're going to dive into the code a little bit and see what's going on. First, we're going to talk about the setup. You're going to need to go to Foursquare.com and create a Foursquare app. This will get you the client ID and client secret that you'll need to do OAuth. You'll also need to like a few places so that when we actually make the API call to get venues you like, you'll have a little bit of data returned. We'll talk about the server code. This is the proxy server that we talked about earlier. This is where you'll be actually making your OAuth requests. And finally, we'll talk about how the client actually handles the access token and makes requests to Foursquare. In order to set this up, you're going to need to go to developer.foursquare.com. You'll see a page like this. The next thing you're going to want to do is go up to the My App section. You'll notice that I've already created a few test apps here to build the Foursquare connector. But when you are coming in here to create your new one, you're going to want to go over here on the right side and click Create a New App. The first thing you're going to want to do is give your app a name. Doesn't matter too much what it is. And you have to actually give it a welcome page or URL, though this doesn't matter in practice. It just can't be empty. The last thing you need to enter here is a redirect URI. The redirect URI field is actually very important. We're going to see this later, but when you make an OAuth request, one of the parameters in your request is the redirect URI parameter. This is where you want Foursquare to send the end user back once they've logged into the Foursquare website. Foursquare needs to know in advance what redirect URIs it can trust for your application as a security measure. So any redirect URI parameter that you send in your OAuth requests, you need to make sure that there's a match for that trusted URI on this website. When you do this tutorial, you're going to want to enter a trusted redirect URI, something like this, and then hit Save Changes. And there you have it. You have a new Foursquare app, and this has the client ID and client secret that you're going to need to use in order to make OAuth requests. Finally, you're going to want to go and find some random place or a few different random places, and you're going to want to go to the detailed view for that venue and come down here and click Like. You might want to do this in a few places just so you have a little bit more data when you bring back information from Foursquare. So let's dive into our server code a bit. As you remember, this is the code that our proxy server is running, and this is where you'll see our OAuth requests happen. We used a Node Express server for our example, but you have a lot of flexibility there with what you use for your backend. So the top of this file is mainly set up. It's not too important. But we're going to come down here to the meat of this file, which is our redirect route. So this is the route that Foursquare redirects to once they have performed authentication and the user has granted access to our app. They'll come back here and there will be a code that we can grab. As we talked about earlier, once you have this code, you're going to actually set up a request with that code to request a long-lived access token. So you'll notice we put the code in here along with our client ID and our client secret, in addition to our redirect URI, which we already talked about. Once we have that request object, we're going to create a post request for it and send it to this endpoint at Foursquare.com. This is our proxy server asking for a long-lived access token. So once we have that set up, we actually make the request here. The response we get should look like this. It should have a small body that just has an access token parameter. We want to parse out that access token. And then the last step in this server code is we're going to store that access token in cookie storage. This is going to allow our client JavaScript to access the access token and make a request to the Foursquare API. The final step is we are going to send the user back to the front end web page, the Foursquare.html page. I'm going to go to that page now and just show you what's in there. This is the Foursquare.html page. This is the main page that the user is going to see and interact with. At the top here, we're just including a lot of JavaScript that we need. For example, the Tableau SDK, and also Ajax's library for cookie storage, which we'll use to pass the access token around between our client and server. This web page is very simple. There's a few titles here that we switch around depending on the current state of the user, whether they're logged in or not. We also have a Connect to Foursquare button, which actually passes the user from our app to the Foursquare login. And we have a button here that downloads the venues that the user likes once they're logged in and authenticated. Finally, let's check out our client JavaScript file. The first important part of this file is the doAuth redirect call. This is what's going to be called on click of the Connect to Foursquare button. You'll notice here that we're constructing a URL that starts with auth URL, which is defined in this config file up here. This code takes us to foursquare.com, and it takes us to their OAuth 2 endpoint. In this initial call, we're asking for just a code. We're not trying to get an access token at this point, because that would require our client secret. And again, we don't want to store that in the client JavaScript file. We're passing our client ID to Foursquare, and we're also passing them a redirect URI. This is the trusted redirect URI that we added on the Foursquare website, and this will redirect the user back to the server code once they've authenticated with Foursquare. So now the user is at Foursquare. They sign in, give us access, and like we've already seen, the code is returned to our server. The code is then upgraded to an access token, and then our server stores that access token in the cookie storage. So what happens next? Well, we need to get the access token out of cookie storage so that the user can use it to make a request. We grab the access token out of cookie storage in the init function. As you'll see right here. This function is called when the user is redirected to the client page. If you remember from previous tutorials, the WDC runs in two distinct phases, the interactive phase and the data gathering phase. We retrieve the token in the interactive phase, but we actually need to use the token in the data gathering phase. But since the two phases run in different contexts, we need to store the access token somewhere secure so we can access it later. The Tableau object has a password field designed specifically for this. Now, in the data gathering phase, when we call getTableData to actually make the API request to Foursquare, we can access the access token from the Tableau password field. Once we have that access token, we will use it to build the URI that makes the call to Foursquare to ask for venues that the user likes. The rest of this code is very similar to what you've seen before in some of the starter examples. One final thing to note, you will need to make one additional WDC API call for a successful OAuth implementation. That is, you're going to have to set always show auth UI to true. This tells Tableau that during an extract refresh, we may need to reprompt for credentials. And that's all it takes. We already saw the demo of this running at the beginning, so we're not going to repeat that. I would encourage you to check out the written tutorials for more details. Thank you for watching.